The following is a 5-minute presentation that I gave at a recent panel discussion on how engineering analysis of failure may help us to provide insight into failures in disease and biology. So here we go. My first point is that failure reveals design. For example, 19th century neuroscientists faced the following puzzle. Are there particular areas of the brain that are associated with particular functions? In the mid-19th century, no one knew the answer to that question. But then an accident occurred in a work situation, and that accident drove a metal rod through a worker's brain and destroyed the frontal lobe of that person's brain. And following that injury to the frontal lobe, that person seemed to have changed particular kinds of changed behavior. And that led some people to ask, is the frontal lobe of the brain associated with particular behavioral functions? And following that, people then began to look at lesions of the brain, thinking that a lesion represents a failure in a particular component of the brain, and they associated the failure of those components to particular changes in behavior or cognitive function. And therefore, they were able to reverse engineer, by studying failure of particular components of the brain, the spatial design of the brain by mapping different brain locations and regions to particular behavioral functions. Again, a kind of reverse engineering. And that leads to my second point, which is that much of biology is actually reverse engineering, using failures to figure out how normal function works. Here's another kind of reverse engineering in biology. There's a lot of variation in the density of bones among different vertebrates. Why? In order to answer that question, we essentially have to reverse engineer the forces of natural selection that have acted on bone density and shaped the different bone density patterns that we see. For example, heavier, denser bones may be relatively inefficient because they're costlier to make. They make the organism heavier and slower, and overall reduce efficiency. But balanced against that reduced efficiency, heavier bones may provide greater safety by being able to withstand greater stress, for example. So we might imagine bone density to be an outcome of the trade-off between efficiency and safety. And engineers have great insight into the trade-off between efficiency and safety. That's something that happens in many aspects of engineering design. For example, think about the steering of a car. When you make the steering mechanism of a car respond very quickly, then the car can correct its course very quickly. It's very efficient in making corrections. But a very rapid response in the steering mechanism is prone to oversteering and can lead to accidents. So that reduces safety. So basically, one has to tune the steering mechanism for a trade-off between efficiency and safety. And as I said, engineers spend a lot of time thinking about such trade-offs between efficiency and safety. And I imagine that in biology, many traits also face this trade-off between efficiency and safety. And if we can understand that tuning and how it sometimes fails, we would get greater insight into the nature of disease. My third point is that in biology, precise traits often arise from sloppy components. For example, the making of individual proteins is known to be quite random and highly stochastic, quite sloppy at the protein level. Also, the firing of individual neurons is susceptible to a great deal of stochasticity. So we also have sloppiness then at these component levels. But in spite of that component level sloppiness, many biological traits are highly precise. And so how does that precision arise from underlying sloppiness? We can think of the car's steering mechanism again as an example. If you're steering and the steering mechanism in the car, the different components of the steering mechanism are relatively imprecise and a bit sloppy, and so you tend to get off course, then when you're driving, if you're too far to the left, you turn to the right and you get back on course. So error correction can compensate for sloppy components and keep the behavior of the system quite precise. And much of engineering design depends on error-correcting feedback, and so that allows precise function to arise from sloppy components. And engineers have great insight into the nature of error-correcting feedback. And so that's my final point, which is that error-correcting feedback is the single greatest principle of design in both biology and in engineering. And as I said, engineers spend a lot of time trying to understand error-correcting feedback, and they have a lot of insight into the best ways to design error-correcting feedback and the situations in which error-correcting feedback fail. And in biology, failure of the error-correcting feedback mechanisms, which are throughout our bodies, are likely to lead to disease. So this is another example of how engineering analysis can provide insight into the nature of disease. So the 4 points were: failure reveals design, biology is often reverse engineering, precise traits arise from sloppy components, and that precision arises by error-correcting feedback, the single greatest principle of design. Thank you.